I'm Roddy Nikpour. I am the executive producer of Getting It Right, this podcast produced by none other than Madison Knutson, with whom I'm sitting now. So, hi, Madison.
Hi. Yeah, I'm also in the room, yes.
We know who you are because you've been hosting this podcast for 4 episodes, and production is just wrapping up. And I just want to talk to you a bit about this project and some of the what now questions moving into the future. So most importantly, as we're wrapping up production on the podcast, how do you feel?
I feel there's a lot of feelings I have right now. I'm still in like the editing phase as of the recording of this episode, but I think I feel pretty good about like my skills and what I've been doing so far with at least with like the technical recording of it. And then as with the story, I'm like really excited for the episodes to come out, because this is a topic that I do care about because I am from Alaska, and this is something that I followed for a long time. I think I'm excited for it to come out. I'm also it's a lot of work and I like it, but it's also like, okay, I'm gonna get it out and then I'm gonna like take a break for a little bit.
I mean, you've edited podcasts before. This is not your first time doing this.
Yeah.
But what was there anything different about doing this, that whether from a production standpoint or an editorial standpoint, that felt really different for you?
A lot of creativity. I think with like a lot of journalism, like products, a lot of like media, it's very much like straightforward. Like, we're gonna do this. We're not going to be too creative. We're going to put a music bed under it, and it's going to be like a pretty generic music bed, and we're not going to get too creative because we don't want to influence our audience. And with this, like, especially with the hooks, it's been like, okay, you need to do like some sort of creative thing. Not like needed, but it's to hook the audience. And so I've had to like be like, okay, what sounds good? What would I like to hear? And like having to be a little bit more creative than I usually am, or that journalism allows, because it's like supposed to be straightforward for the audience.
What I want to be clear, what you're doing is definitely journalism, but what you're talking about is this distinction between, podcasting as a medium and what that means versus like if this was a radio feature on a nationally syndicated newscast, right? I mean, by virtue of being a podcast, you can do journalism in a way that's more I don't know, creative, like you said, maybe it's the right word, where you're not, you're liable to like whatever editorial standards I put for you, which are, all journalistic, but the job is slightly different insofar as, you're telling a story, but like your job isn't just to deliver information. It's also more to entertain a little bit. And that's where a lot of these like creative touches, I think, are coming from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely different. It's also with the podcast, it is a lot of work, because you are like editing multiple episodes that require like there's a lot of information in these to go through, versus like on an NPR, just like doing like for example like a piece on National Public Radio about one specific news story. It's just one segment and then it's over. Mm-hmm. It's like a 3-minute segment at like the very most, maybe like even 2 minutes, and then it's done. But with this, it's like multiple episodes that is like 10 or more minutes longer. Yeah. And so it's a lot of stuff to work through.
Well, you did a good job on the technical aspect, I will say. We were just listening to the trailer again before this, and it was immaculate. No notes. But I want to talk about the editorial side of this a little bit, because you said you're from Alaska, and you've taken an interest in covering this story for this project of MMIP. I'm curious, like, one thing that you were adamant about in the 4th episode, courtesy of our second reader, Celeste Sepsi, is community engagement reporting. And I know in actually a different context, you've done some solutions journalism reporting too. Can you talk about how this podcast either uses those methods, or how making this podcast has informed your perspective about like community engagement reporting? Like, how does that all fitting in, and how are you taking that moving forward?
I think starting off with like, are there solutions journalism or community reporting, like community engagement reporting, methods in this? I think there's a lot of solutions journalism methods in this, especially in the 4th episode with like what's next, because you can't really like discuss what's next for a community without like discussing solutions and like what they do for the community. Like specifically, we talk about like a Senate bill, and that is a solution in and of itself, and that will have pros and that will have cons, and it may work for the community or it may not. And then like also throughout each episode, the guests weigh in on like the topic and they provide their own solutions. In episode 2, it's like, how do we make sure that these biopics are respectful for people, respectful to the communities that they depict? Does this work? Does this not? How do you, like, exploring the solutions that have been explored, but also new ones being proposed by the guests. Mm-hmm. And on the topic of like community engagement reporting, I think that I learned a lot more about that, and through Celeste as well, but also through one of the guests, Vera Starbard. She brought up a really interesting point in our interview last in fall of 2024 when we had the initial recording, and she brought up that like her feelings about how journalism media had depicted the Indigenous community, and like some nuances that she saw in like how negative journalism tend to go to with statistics, which she acknowledged like made sense for the time. It was COVID, but also the point that like, why does it always have to be negative? And I thought that was really interesting, and like then brought me to like diving into like, okay, well, that's not really necessarily depicting the entirety of a community, which these pieces might not have been intending to do that, but it's also just true that like no community is just entirely negative.
Well, I was talking with Abby Goldstein, who is the director of the Public Media Content Consortium, I think it's called, and something that she's been saying a lot lately that I think resonates with this story, and maybe if I can impart to you in some way, is, you know, she says that there's kind of a problem in news of being doom and gloom about everything, and that's been for decades. You know, especially lately, just like there's a lot of like retaliation against journalism and whatever, a lot of stuff. And so she kind of says there's a hope deficit, and that's not to say that you just, you know, write feel good stories just to write feel good stories, but there's so much happening in the community that is newsworthy, that is not all missing and murdered Indigenous people. There are festivals, there are anniversaries, milestone celebrations of culture that maybe deserve news coverage. And, you know, I don't have the answers to the future of news, but I also think that there's a lot about that lies in community engagement reporting, yes, to solve problems that are like bad things, but also ways to consider bringing audiences to you through like good things that are happening in the community and joy, and like giving them a place to celebrate and be together. And this is all sounding really corny, but is that, I don't know, that kind of sounds like something that we could do. And that kind of leads me to a question I want to ask you too about like, this is a question like for you, about you, but also curious about like advice you'd give to someone who is a white journalist like you or Kyle Hopkins, covering issues for an otherwise marginalized group like Indigenous people. I mean, maybe you've already answered this by talking about community engagement reporting, but what's the approach that you will take into your career as a journalist when covering an issue like MMIP or Indigenous communities in general? And / what advice would you give to someone?
I think there's a lot of steps to like covering that topic, and I feel like we kind of discuss and like what is talked about in the 4th episode with community engagement reporting. It's difficult to report on something negative and then just leave the community. You kind of you need to be like a part of the community. And I know that like, especially in Alaska right now, there are not like tons and tons of media outlets that can devote, reporters to connecting with one specific community and then being able to like report all these stories. But I think it really is just like talking to the community and talking to people. Because if you just talk to experts, they will provide like a baseline, like here's the problem and here's how we've seen it as like a organization. But I think people have so many interesting stories and perspectives because they've experienced that firsthand.
Why do you think journalists don't talk to the community as much as maybe they should?
Oh, that's a hard question. I think we are taught sort of like experts are these like pretty reliable sources. They will give us like they're the government, and they're pretty like they're there to comment. They're there to like to be a reliable source. Most people know the government. For a while in journalism, most people generally trusted the government. And I think that, journalists might be afraid of like talking to people, maybe if like their thoughts might bring up some like ethical issues and stuff, that because there's a lot of community members, there's a lot of different voices. I think there's ways to balance those voices. But we often get nervous of like venturing out and talking to people. And there's also just like a technical aspect of like how much time in the day do we have to devote to like going out and talking to people, because like often journalists don't like the person on the street ones because you're just standing out there getting perspective from people. But I think if you search on like Facebook, there's so many people there who will talk, who are ingrained in their community and who have something to say and have experienced stuff. Yeah.
I think there's a lot to say about like, you mentioned like the technical aspect of this, like time in the day or whatever, but also you mentioned like Facebook and going online to talk to people in like, these Facebook groups that are really passionate about MMIP issues or whatever, any given topic. It's a good way to find everyday sources. But something I've been trying to think about personally, I'm curious if this ties in, is just remembering that like we live in the real world, not in the metaverse yet, right? Mm-hmm. So like all the stuff that we do, the journalism, the storytelling, the conversations we have, it's about the world around us, not just like this idea of like, indigenous people in my head or something. It's like, no, there's like real people, your neighbors, people in your state who are dying, who are going missing. And I don't know. I just wonder if journalism is like a way to like remind people, not just remind people, but like build community in a meaningful way. I mean, to me, that's like, because information is not something that it can be easily monetized anymore. So what can we do to preserve this industry? And I think it's community building, and it's through storytelling, and it's still through holding powerful people accountable. But the community building aspect to me is important on like in a geographical, tangible sense, which is why I'm glad you focused this in Alaska, which, as you also talked about in episode 3, is not monolithic, but it's still tethered to this region, if that makes sense. So yeah. I have 2 small questions for you, and then we can be done. The 4-part series is, as of this recording, it's not done yet, but it will be very soon. But we have the scripts and everything. So what do you think the listener should take away from this? If you had like a wish list, or rather, what is your intention, right? If someone to listen to this series, they know nothing about this, what are 3 things that you want them to either do, think, or say based on listening to this?
I think first, just to know more about Alaska. I get so many questions as an Alaskan in Arizona from just like college students who don't necessarily know about the state because obviously they don't live there. But it's also like a really cool place with a lot of great people. So I want people to take away, like, even if you're not planning to visit, just like don't discount Alaska. And like, you know, we have a lot of other stuff other than just being like close to Russia and like other things.
This podcast is not sponsored by the Tourism Office of Alaska.
No. Me personally, I'm like, okay. I think also with MMIP, it's something that will still be ongoing, unfortunately, after this. As much as we want to like eliminate it entirely, it happens, but I want people to like know it is a thing, because often we have communities that are away from more like indigenous villages or indigenous communities, and so we don't really see that side of that problem that's happening. And so I think just like if you listen to this podcast, just take a second, and if you want to watch Alaska Daily, watch Alaska Daily. But also like there's so many other resources out there for you to explore. Reading just articles about it, and just being like supportive. I think connecting with your community is important too, and like learning about the indigenous people who like have inhabited the land that you are on and have a really, really interesting culture that has been there for a long time. I think that's another one too. And then finally, just like maybe being more critical of the media, especially like television and movies that you are consuming that are sort of like based off of television and movies.
I was going to ask you about that if you didn't talk about it. So just tell me more about like what critical in what way? Like be upset about it, or like
not necessarily upset, just maybe if you are like, oh, that's a really interesting like real life event. What happened there? Just understanding that isn't all of the story. Obviously they can't fit in like, 5 years of whatever research they've done or 5 years of journalism in one movie or in, a season of a TV show. So just, again, being curious, understanding that, there's going to be some faults with journalism and, some faults with journalism. And
you can explain that.
There's going to be some people who, maybe make mistakes, don't necessarily think too much before they publish something, or, they maybe publish something at a time, and then things change super fast, and so that information isn't necessarily true. And then, also just knowing like journalists are humans too. They make a lot of mistakes. And I think as much as traditional journalists would like for, reporters and everything to be like I'm not gonna say robots, but like essentially just like a person who is unbiased, doesn't sway either way, isn't like feeling anything towards stories. They're humans. They're gonna have emotions. There's a lot of stories where they're like, okay, you need to be stone-faced, like this isn't the time for emotions. But then you have those stories where it's like it's real people, and like someone is crying on the phone with you, and you have to like sit there and be like, I'm a human talking to another human too. So just knowing that there's a human who's also researching this stuff to bring it to you. I
like you talking about this because part of the reason we're working together is because I know you were there for Atria Moneshny's podcast presentation for Inside Objectivity, and this was a very big theme in her show. So shout out to Atria Moneshny.
Yeah. Her podcast was awesome. Yeah.
Well, I don't want to take too much more of your time. So the last thing I just want to talk about is the fact that you are graduating, and this podcast was a major part of that. So first of all, congratulations. And remind me what's next for you after this podcast is over. Are you going to grad school? Are you going to work in Alaska, or some other third thing that I haven't articulated? So
I'm finishing my bachelor's this spring. I am graduating a year earlier than I would be, and I am just going straight into my master's. I'm doing the accelerated master's program. I'm staying here at the Walter Cronkite School, so I'll be doing a few more classes, and then next year finding a job, hopefully in Alaska. I'd love to work for Alaska Public Media, but we'll see where it takes me, and then even if I stay here in Arizona too, that's great. But just exploring probably audio. Yeah, definitely want to stay in this realm. Yeah.
I think, it's great to want to go back to Alaska because that's where you're from, and you'll feel that kind of good feeling there, hometown coming, but also, the connections you're making now, I think will serve you in that hunt. And someone who works in public media too, I think you'll have good fortunes as you look in public media up in Alaska. But I'm excited to be part of it at all, Madison. So thanks for trusting me to help you make this show, because it's been really fun.
No, thank you so much for all your help and the expertise you've provided with everything. Yeah,
that's what we do.